Picture this. You're a bank teller in 1875 Missouri when 6 armed men ride into town, dismount calmly, and walk into your bank like they own the place. The leader tips his hat politely, asks for all your money with a smile, and introduces himself as Jesse James. You're about to become part of the most famous crime spree in American history. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'm curious, where are you watching this right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. And if this story moves you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful true stories. Now, let me tell you exactly how this all unfolded. The morning of February the 13th, 1866, started like any other in Liberty, Missouri. The Clay County Savings Association had just opened its doors for business when 12 men on horseback rode slowly down the main street. Nothing unusual there. Missouri was still recovering from the Civil War, and armed men were a common sight. But these weren't just any armed men. They were about to pull off what many historians consider the first daylight bank robbery in American peacetime history. You're standing behind the teller cage, counting yesterday's deposits when the door opens with its familiar chime. 2 men walk in, dressed respectably enough. Dark coats, hats pulled low, but not suspiciously so. They approach your window with the confident stride of men conducting legitimate business. The taller one, clean-shaven with intense blue eyes, smiles pleasantly and tips his hat. "Good morning," he says in a voice that's surprisingly cultured for a frontier town. "I wonder if you might help us with a small matter." Before you can respond, you notice something that makes your blood turn cold. Both men have their hands resting on the butts of Colt Navy revolvers, and their fingers aren't relaxed. The shorter man moves to the side, positioning himself where he can watch both you and the door. The pleasant smile never leaves the tall man's face, but his eyes have gone hard as winter stone. "We'd like to make a withdrawal," he continues conversationally. "All of it, if you please." Your mouth goes dry. Outside, you can hear horses moving restlessly, the creak of leather saddles, the low murmur of voices. How many men are out there? Your hands shake as you look at the cash drawer, then back at those cold blue eyes. This isn't how you imagined dying, but the alternative. Complying with these men feels like betraying everything you've worked for. "Now, friend," the tall man says, and his voice carries a hint of impatience beneath the courtesy. "I'd hate for this to become unpleasant. We're reasonable men conducting reasonable business. You give us what's in that drawer and that safe, and we'll be on our way. Nobody gets hurt, nobody gets blamed, and you get to go home to your family tonight with a story that'll last you the rest of your life. This is your introduction to Jesse Woodson James, though you don't know his name yet. You won't learn it for weeks, when the newspapers start calling him the most dangerous man in Missouri. Right now, he's just a polite stranger with dead eyes and steady hands, asking you to hand over everything your bank owns. The Civil War had ended less than a year ago, but in Missouri, it felt like it would never truly be over. The state had been torn apart by 4 years of guerrilla warfare, neighbor fighting neighbor, brother against brother. Jesse James had spent his teenage years riding with Confederate guerrilla units, learning to kill quickly and disappear like smoke. The war taught him that conventional rules didn't apply when survival was at stake. And survival, for former Confederate guerrillas in post-war Missouri, was definitely at stake. But Jesse's story didn't begin with guns and violence. It started on a farm in Clay County, Missouri, where a boy named Jesse Woodson James was born on September 5th, 1847, into a world that was already showing cracks that would soon split it apart. His father, Robert James, was a Baptist preacher and hemp farmer who dreamed of striking it rich in the California goldfields. His mother, Zerelda, was a strong-willed woman who would prove to be the most influential person in Jesse's life, for better and worse. The The James family farm was prosperous by Missouri standards, worked by enslaved people, and managed with the kind of hard, practical sense that built the American frontier. Robert James was respected in the community, known for his passionate sermons and his progressive ideas about education. He helped found William Jewell College in Liberty, the same town where his son would later commit his first bank robbery. Life seemed to stretch ahead predictably. Jesse would grow up to farm the land, marry a local girl, raise children, and live the quiet life of a Missouri farmer. But in 1850, when Jesse was only 3 years old, his father caught gold fever and left for California, leaving Zerelda to manage the farm and raise 3 young children alone. Robert James never made it home. He died in the gold fields, leaving his family not rich but struggling, and leaving Jesse without the steadying influence of a father during the most formative years of his life. Zerelda James was not a woman to be broken by tragedy. She remarried twice, first to a man named Benjamin Sims, who died within a few years, then to Dr. Reuben Samuel, a quiet physician who would become the only father figure Jesse really knew. But by then, Jesse was already showing signs of the restless energy and quick temper that would define his life. He was smart, charming when he wanted to be, and absolutely fearless in a way that worried the adults around him. The Missouri of Jesse's youth was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The state was officially part of the Union, but its southern counties were filled with Confederate sympathizers who owned slaves and resented federal authority. When the Civil War began in 1861, Missouri didn't secede, but it might as well have. The state became a battleground where Union and Confederate forces fought not just each other, but also guerrilla bands, bushwhackers, jayhawkers, and various militias whose loyalties shifted with the wind. Jesse was 14 when the war started, old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to fight in any organized way. His older brother Frank had already joined the Confederate Army, leaving Jesse to help manage the farm and protect the family. But protecting the family in Civil War Missouri meant more than just working the fields and tending the livestock. It meant picking a side in a conflict that was tearing the state apart, county by county, family by family. The James family's loyalties were never in doubt. They were Southern sympathizers who supported the Confederate cause and owned several enslaved people who worked their hemp farm. When Union militias began targeting Confederate sympathizers in Clay County, the James family found themselves under suspicion. Dr. Samuel was arrested and briefly imprisoned. Union soldiers searched the farm repeatedly, looking for evidence of Confederate activity. In 1863, when Jesse was 16, Union militias escalated their tactics. They began targeting not just active Confederate supporters, but their families as well. The theory was that applying pressure to families would discourage men from joining guerrilla bands. In practice, it had the opposite effect. When Union soldiers came to the James farm looking for information about Confederate guerrillas, they treated Dr. Samuel roughly, questioned Zerelda harshly, and allegedly tortured Jesse by placing a rope around his neck and partially hanging him to force him to reveal information he didn't have. This incident, whether exactly as later described or not, marked a turning point in Jesse's life. Whatever sympathy he might have had for the Union cause evaporated. Whatever respect he had for lawful authority disappeared. From that moment on, Jesse James viewed the world as divided into 2 categories, his people and his enemies. And his enemies, he decided, deserved whatever happened to them. In 1864, at the age of 17, Jesse James joined Bloody Bill Anderson's guerrilla band, one of the most feared and ruthless Confederate irregular units operating in Missouri. Anderson was a psychopath who collected scalps and taught his men that the only good Union soldier was a dead Union soldier. Under his command, Jesse learned not just how to fight, but how to kill without hesitation or remorse. Guerrilla warfare in Civil War Missouri was brutal beyond anything most people can imagine. It wasn't the relatively civilized conflict between organized armies that characterized most of the Civil War. It was a blood feud where quarter was neither asked nor given, where civilians were targets, and where the rules of warfare had been abandoned in favor of pure vengeance. Jesse's unit didn't just fight Union soldiers, they ambushed supply trains, murdered suspected informants, and terrorized anyone who supported the federal government. The most infamous incident of Jesse's guerrilla career was the Centralia massacre in September 1864. Anderson's band, including Jesse, attacked a train in Centralia, Missouri, robbing the passengers and murdering 24 unarmed Union soldiers who were traveling home on leave. When a Union force arrived to pursue the guerrillas, Anderson's men ambushed them, killing over 100 soldiers in a running battle that resembled a slaughter more than a military engagement. Jesse James, at 17, was present for this massacre. Some accounts suggest he personally killed several Union soldiers, including Major AVE Johnston, the commander of the pursuing force. Whether or not these specific claims are true, there's no doubt that Jesse participated in the violence and absorbed its lessons. He learned that overwhelming force, applied suddenly and without warning, could overcome almost any opposition. He learned that fear was a weapon as powerful as bullets. And he learned that once you crossed certain lines, there was no going back. The guerrilla war also taught Jesse practical skills that would serve him well in his later career as an outlaw. He learned to ride hard and fast, to navigate by instinct through unfamiliar territory, to live rough for weeks at a time. He learned to plan operations carefully, to coordinate with small groups of men under extreme pressure, and to disappear into the landscape when pursuit became too hot. Most importantly, he learned to think like a hunted man, always watching for threats, always planning escape routes, always ready to fight or flee at a moment's notice. When the Civil War ended in April 1865, Jesse James was 18 years old and had spent his formative years learning to kill. The skills that had made him valuable as a Confederate guerrilla, his fearlessness, his tactical intelligence, his ability to lead men in dangerous situations, had no legal applications in peacetime Missouri. Former Confederate soldiers could return to farming or take up trades, but former guerrillas were marked men. They had too many enemies, too much blood on their hands, too many reasons to fear both legal prosecution and personal vengeance. Jesse attempted to surrender under the same terms offered to other Confederate forces, but he was shot and badly wounded by Union troops who either didn't recognize his white flag or didn't care. He spent months recovering from his wounds at his family's farm, weak and uncertain about his future. The war was over, but for Jesse James, the peace felt more dangerous than the conflict had been. During his recovery, Jesse had time to think about his options. He could try to disappear, perhaps heading west to start over where his past wouldn't follow him. He could stay in Missouri and hope that time would heal the wounds of war, that former enemies could learn to coexist peacefully. Or he could continue the war by other means, using the skills he'd learned as a guerrilla to survive in a world that had no place for men like him. The choice he made would shape not just his own destiny, but the mythology of the American West. Jesse James decided that if society wouldn't accept him, he would take what he needed from society. If the law considered him a criminal, he would be the most successful criminal in American history. And if he was going to live outside the law, he would do it with style, flair, and a kind of twisted honor that would make him a legend. But first, he needed to learn how to rob banks, and the best teacher for that particular skill was going to be experience, trial by fire, and the kind of luck that seems to favor the truly reckless. The quiet farm boy who had once dreamed of following in his father's footsteps as a preacher was gone forever. In his place stood Jesse James, 18 years old, wounded but not broken, and about to become the most famous outlaw in American history. The transition from guerrilla fighter to bank robber wasn't as dramatic as you might expect. For Jesse and his associates, it felt like a natural continuation of the war by other means. The banks they targeted weren't just financial institutions. They were symbols of the federal authority and northern capitalism that had destroyed their world. Robbing them felt like striking back at the forces that had defeated the Confederacy and left former guerrillas with no place in the new order. The planning for the Liberty Bank robbery began in the winter of 1865 to 1866, just months after the war's end. Frank James, Jesse's older brother, had returned from his own Confederate service and was facing the same bleak prospects as other former rebels. The James brothers were joined by Cole Younger and his brothers, former members of Quantrill's Raiders who had fought alongside the James boys during the war. These weren't desperate criminals driven by poverty. They were intelligent, experienced fighters who saw bank robbery as both a practical way to survive and a political statement about their refusal to accept defeat. The target was carefully chosen. The Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri, was a small but prosperous institution that served the surrounding farming community. It was located in the county seat, which meant it handled government money as well as private deposits. More importantly, from the gang's perspective, it was owned and operated by men who had supported the Union during the war, making it a legitimate target in their minds. The gang spent weeks observing the bank, learning the routines of its employees, the patterns of local law enforcement, and the layout of the town. They noted that the bank opened at 9 in the morning and closed at 4 in the afternoon. They identified the best escape routes and planned contingencies in case something went wrong. This wasn't a desperate grab for cash. It was a military operation planned and executed with the same attention to detail they'd used when ambushing Union supply trains. On the morning of February the 13th, 1866, 12 members of the gang rode into Liberty in small groups, timing their arrival to appear casual and uncoordinated. Some of them had legitimate business in town, or at least plausible cover stories for being there. Others positioned themselves at strategic points around the bank, ready to discourage pursuit or create diversions if necessary. The actual robbery would be carried out by just 2 men, Frank James and another gang member whose identity has been debated by historians ever since. Jesse James was not one of the 2 men who entered the bank that day. At 18, he was still considered too young and inexperienced for such a critical role. His job was to wait with the horses and help cover the gang's retreat, essentially serving as lookout and backup. It was a supporting role that frustrated him, but one that taught him valuable lessons about bank robbery that would serve him well in future operations. The robbery itself was almost anticlimactically simple. The 2 men entered the bank shortly after it opened, when only the cashier and his assistant were present. They displayed their weapons, demanded money, and encountered no resistance. The bank employees, faced with armed men who clearly knew what they were doing, handed over approximately $60,000 in cash and bonds, a fortune in 1866, equivalent to more than $1 million today. The entire operation took less than 10 minutes. The robbers walked out of the bank, mounted their horses, and rode out of town before most of Liberty's citizens even realized what had happened. They had committed what was almost certainly the first daylight bank robbery in American peacetime history. And they had done it with a precision and professionalism that amazed law enforcement officials. But the Liberty robbery also revealed the darker side of the James gang's methods. As the robbers were leaving town, they encountered a young student named George Wymore walking across the town square. For reasons that have never been entirely clear, perhaps because he might have been able to identify them, perhaps because they wanted to create fear and confusion, or perhaps simply because violence had become so natural to them during the war. One of the gang members shot and killed the innocent bystander. Wymore's murder cast a shadow over what might otherwise have been viewed as a daring but relatively harmless crime. It demonstrated that the James gang was willing to kill to protect their operations, and it established a pattern of violence that would follow them throughout their careers. They weren't just thieves, they were killers who would murder anyone who threatened their freedom or their profits. The reaction to the Liberty Bank robbery was swift and intense. Local authorities immediately organized posses to pursue the robbers, But the gang had vanished into the Missouri countryside like smoke. The former guerrillas had learned during the war how to disappear into familiar territory, how to use safe houses and sympathetic families to avoid capture. Within hours, they had scattered to predetermined hiding places where they could wait for the immediate heat to die down. More significantly, the robbery captured the imagination of the press and the public in ways that the gang probably hadn't anticipated. Newspapers across the country reported on the daring daylight raid, often with a mixture of condemnation and grudging admiration for the robbers' audacity. The fact that the perpetrators were believed to be former Confederate guerrillas added a political dimension to the story that resonated with readers both North and South. In the defeated Confederacy, some people viewed the bank robbery as a continued resistance to Northern authority. These former rebels saw the James gang not as criminals, but as patriots who refused to surrender even after the official end of the war. Sympathy for the robbers was particularly strong in Missouri, where many residents had suffered under Union occupation and martial law. In the North, the robbery was seen as evidence that Confederate guerrillas remained a threat to law and order, even in peacetime. It reinforced arguments that former rebels needed to be watched carefully and that Reconstruction policies should be harsh enough to prevent future violence. The political implications of the crime were almost as important as the financial losses. For Jesse James personally, the Liberty robbery was a watershed moment. Although he hadn't been one of the men who actually entered the bank, he had participated in planning and executing a successful operation against overwhelming odds. The $60,000 was divided among the gang members, giving Jesse more money than he had ever seen in his life. More importantly, he had proven to himself and his associates that the skills he'd learned during the war could be profitable in peacetime. But the robbery also marked the beginning of a life that would offer no possibility of normal existence. From the moment the gang rode out of Liberty, Jesse James was a wanted man. There would be no going back to farming or honest work, no settling down with a family and living peacefully. He had chosen a path that led only to more violence, more danger, and ultimately to an early grave. The success of the Liberty robbery convinced the gang that they had found their calling. Bank robbery offered the excitement and danger they craved, the financial rewards they needed, and the opportunity to continue their war against the forces that had defeated the Confederacy. Over the next few months, they began planning their next operation, confident that they could repeat their success indefinitely. They were wrong about that, but they wouldn't learn the truth for many years. In the meantime, Jesse James was about to discover that being a successful outlaw required not just courage and skill, but a kind of theatrical flair that would make him famous across America and around the world. The success of the Liberty Bank robbery energized the James gang and convinced them that they had discovered a sustainable way of life. During the spring and summer of 1866, they began planning additional operations, studying potential targets, and refining their methods. But they also discovered that being successful outlaws required more than just the ability to rob banks. It required the ability to avoid capture, manage public perception, and maintain the loyalty of their associates under increasing pressure. Jesse James emerged during this period as one of the gang's key leaders, despite his youth. While Frank James and Cole Younger had more experience and were technically senior to him, Jesse possessed a combination of charisma, tactical intelligence, and absolute fearlessness that made him a natural commander. He was also more willing than the others to take risks, more aggressive in pursuing opportunities, and more creative in planning operations. The gang's second major robbery occurred on October 30th, 1866, when they targeted the Alexander Mitchell and Company Bank in Lexington, Missouri. This operation demonstrated how quickly Jesse and his associates were learning from experience. They had refined their planning process, improved their coordination, and developed contingency plans for various scenarios. The robbery itself was executed with the same precision as the Liberty job, but with additional sophistication that showed the gang's growing expertise. The Lexington robbery also revealed Jesse's developing understanding of the importance of public relations in his chosen profession. Rather than simply taking the money and disappearing, he made a point of being polite to the bank employees, even apologetic about the necessity of robbing them. He explained that he and his men were former Confederate soldiers who had been driven to desperate measures by their treatment during Reconstruction. This wasn't entirely true, but it played well with Southern sympathizers who were inclined to view the gang as heroes rather than criminals. More importantly, Jesse began cultivating relationships with sympathetic newspaper editors who were willing to print his side of the story. He started writing letters to various publications, explaining his motivations and challenging the versions of events put forward by law enforcement. These letters, which were often eloquent and persuasive, helped create a public image of Jesse James as a gentleman bandit driven to crime by unjust persecution rather than greed or cruelty. The letter-writing campaign was a stroke of genius that set Jesse apart from other outlaws of his era. Most criminals tried to avoid publicity, but Jesse understood that the right kind of publicity could be protective. If enough people viewed him as a hero rather than a villain, it would be harder for authorities to find informants and witnesses willing to testify against him. Sympathetic public opinion could also influence juries and even judges, making successful prosecution more difficult. Jesse's letters typically followed a similar pattern. He would acknowledge that robbery was wrong in principle, but argue that he and his men had been driven to it by circumstances beyond their control. He would claim that they only robbed institutions that represented Northern capital and federal authority, never individuals or local businesses. He would insist that they were gentlemen who treated their victims with respect and never used unnecessary violence. And he would position himself and his gang as the last defenders of Southern honor and Confederate ideals. None of this was entirely accurate, but it was effective propaganda that resonated with audiences who wanted to believe in romantic outlaws fighting against oppressive authority. Jesse was creating a mythology around himself that would outlast his actual criminal career and make him one of the most famous figures in American folklore. The reality of the gang's operations was considerably less romantic than Jesse's public relations efforts suggested. While they generally avoided unnecessary violence during robberies, they were always prepared to kill anyone who threatened them. They murdered several people during their career, including law enforcement officers, bank employees, and innocent bystanders. They also showed no hesitation about robbing ordinary people when the opportunity arose, despite Jesse's claims that they only targeted Northern institutions. But the mythology was more powerful than the reality, and Jesse proved to be remarkably skilled at managing his public image. He understood that people wanted to believe in noble outlaws, and he gave them what they wanted. His letters painted him as a man more sinned against than sinning, a reluctant criminal who would gladly return to honest life if society would give him the chance. The gang's operations during 1867 and 1868 established them as the premier bank robbery outfit in America. They hit targets in Missouri, Kentucky, and Iowa, always using the same basic methodology: careful planning, overwhelming force, applied quickly, and rapid escape into familiar territory. They developed a network of safe houses and sympathetic contacts that allowed them to disappear for weeks or months between operations, living quietly while planning their next job. Jesse's role in these operations continued to expand. He was no longer the inexperienced teenager who had waited with the horses during the Liberty robbery. He was now one of the gang's primary planners and leaders, often serving as the spokesman who dealt with bank employees and witnesses. His combination of courtesy and menace became legendary. He could be charming and polite right up until the moment he shot you, and everyone knew it. The gang's success inevitably attracted the attention of law enforcement agencies across the region. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, America's premier private investigation firm, was hired by several banks and railroads to track down the James gang and bring them to justice. Alan Pinkerton himself took a personal interest in the case, assigning some of his best agents to what would become one of the longest and most expensive manhunts in American history. The Pinkertons brought professional methods and substantial resources to the pursuit of the James Gang, but they also brought an Eastern urban sensibility that put them at a severe disadvantage in rural Missouri. The detectives stood out like sore thumbs in farming communities, where everyone knew everyone else. Their attempts to infiltrate the gang's network of supporters were often clumsy and obvious, and their lack of familiarity with the local terrain made it easy for the outlaws to outmaneuver them. More fundamentally, the Pinkertons underestimated the level of sympathy that existed for the James Gang among ordinary Missourians. They assumed that law-abiding citizens would naturally cooperate with efforts to capture dangerous criminals, but they discovered that many people viewed the outlaws as heroes and the detectives as invaders. Information flowed from the community to the gang, not from the community to law enforcement. Jesse James understood these dynamics and exploited them ruthlessly. He made a point of being generous to poor families, sharing his ill-gotten gains with people who had suffered during the war and Reconstruction. He presented himself as a defender of traditional Southern values against Northern aggression. And he treated local communities with respect, never robbing local banks or businesses, always targeting institutions that could be portrayed as outside enemies. This strategy created a protective web around the gang that was almost impossible for outsiders to penetrate. Jesse could ride openly through certain parts of Missouri, confident that no one would betray him to the authorities. He could count on advance warning when law enforcement operations were being planned, and he could rely on safe houses and supplies whenever he needed them. The combination of tactical skill, public relations savvy, and community support made the James Gang extraordinarily difficult to capture. They could strike anywhere in the region, disappear completely, and resurface weeks later, hundreds of miles away. They seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to avoid their pursuers, appearing and vanishing like ghosts haunting the American frontier. By 1869, Jesse James had evolved from a teenage guerrilla fighter into one of the most famous and feared outlaws in American history. He was only 22 years old, but he commanded a gang that had successfully robbed numerous banks and eluded the best efforts of law enforcement to capture them. He was wealthy, famous, and powerful in a way that few men of his era could match, but he was also trapped by his own success. The very fame that protected him from immediate capture also made it impossible for him to live a normal life. He could never settle down, never relax his guard, never trust anyone completely. He was condemned to a life of constant vigilance and increasing violence, with no possibility of peaceful retirement or redemption. The next phase of his career would test all of these dynamics to their limits, as the James Gang moved beyond bank robbery to even more audacious crimes that would make Jesse James a household name across America and around the world. In July 1873, the James Gang committed the crime that would make them household names across America and established Jesse James as the most famous outlaw of his generation. They robbed their first train, derailing the Rock Island Railroad near Adair, Iowa, and stealing approximately $3,000 from the express car. More importantly, they had invented a new form of crime that captured the American imagination like nothing before it. Train robbery was a logical evolution of the gang's methods, but it required new skills and presented new challenges. Banks were stationary targets that could be observed and studied at leisure, but trains moved according to schedules that had to be learned and anticipated. Stopping a train required more than just threatening the crew. It required physically blocking or derailing the locomotive, which was dangerous and technically demanding. Jesse James approached train robbery with the same methodical planning that had made the gang successful bank robbers. He studied railroad schedules, mapped out routes, and identified the most vulnerable points where trains could be stopped safely. He also recognized that train robbery offered advantages that bank robbery didn't. Trains carried cash shipments that were often larger than bank deposits, and they traveled through sparsely populated areas where escape would be easier. The Adair robbery established the template that the James gang would use for all their subsequent train jobs. They removed a section of track, causing the locomotive to derail and forcing the train to stop. They then robbed the express car, which carried cash and valuables being shipped between cities, and sometimes robbed passengers as well. The entire operation was designed to be completed quickly, before local law enforcement could respond. The public reaction to the first train robbery was immediate and intense. Newspapers across the country reported on the crime with a mixture of horror and fascination. The idea of armed men stopping a train in the middle of nowhere and robbing it like a stagecoach from an earlier era seemed both terrifying and romantic. The James gang had committed a crime that seemed to belong more to fiction than reality. Jesse understood the publicity value of train robbery better than anyone. He began staging his operations for maximum dramatic effect, making sure that passengers and train crews had stories to tell that would enhance his legend. He was unfailingly polite to women and children, often returning personal items that had no monetary value, but great sentimental worth. He made a point of introducing himself to victims, ensuring that his name would be prominently featured in newspaper accounts. The gang's train robberies also demonstrated Jesse's evolution as a criminal mastermind. He had learned to think strategically about crime, considering not just the immediate profits, but the long-term implications of his actions. Train robbery made the gang famous, but it also brought them to the attention of powerful enemies who had the resources to fund extensive manhunts. The railroad companies were much wealthier and more politically connected than the banks the gang had previously targeted. They could afford to hire the best detectives, offer substantial rewards, and pressure government officials to take action. They also had a vested interest in stopping train robbery before it spread to other gangs, making the James gang a priority target for law enforcement across the region. Alan Pinkerton and his detective agency responded to the train robberies by escalating their efforts to capture the gang. They increased the number of agents assigned to the case, raised the rewards for information leading to arrests, and began using more aggressive tactics in their investigations. They also started targeting the gang's support network, arresting people suspected of helping the outlaws and pressuring communities that were believed to be harboring them. The increased pressure from law enforcement forced the James gang to become more careful and more violent. They could no longer rely solely on speed and surprise to avoid capture. They had to be prepared to fight their way out of situations when negotiations failed. Several shootouts during this period resulted in deaths on both sides, escalating the conflict and making peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely. Jesse's personal life during this period was complicated by his growing fame and the increasing dangers of his profession. In 1874, he married his first cousin, Zerelda Amanda Mims, who had been named after his mother. The marriage was both a love match and a practical alliance. Zerelda Mims came from a family that supported the Confederate cause and could be trusted to keep Jesse's secrets. The wedding took place in secrecy, with only immediate family members present. Jesse couldn't risk a public ceremony that might attract the attention of law enforcement or bounty hunters. Even his honeymoon had to be planned around the possibility of sudden flight if the gang's hiding place was discovered. It was hardly the romantic beginning to married life that most couples enjoyed, but it was the best that Jesse could manage given his circumstances. Zerelda James, as she was now known, proved to be an ideal partner for an outlaw's life. She was discreet, loyal, and capable of managing the practical challenges of being married to a man who couldn't live under his own name or stay in one place for extended periods. She also understood that a husband's profession made their relationship dangerous. Association with Jesse James made her a target for kidnapping or worse by people who wanted to pressure him. The couple's domestic arrangements were necessarily unconventional. Jesse couldn't maintain a permanent home or establish normal routines. He moved frequently between safe houses, often staying away for weeks at a time while planning or executing robberies. When he was present, he had to be constantly alert for signs of surveillance or betrayal. It was a stressful existence that would have destroyed most marriages, but Zerelda adapted to it with remarkable resilience. During the mid-1870s, the James Gang reached the peak of their success and notoriety. They were robbing trains and banks across several states, accumulating substantial wealth, and becoming folk heroes to people who viewed them as symbols of resistance to industrial capitalism and federal authority. Jesse James was arguably the most famous person in America. His exploits chronicled in newspapers and dime novels that portrayed him as everything from a bloodthirsty killer to a noble Robin Hood. But the gang's success was also creating internal tensions that would eventually destroy them. The constant pressure from law enforcement was taking a psychological toll on all the members, making them paranoid and quick to suspect betrayal. The large rewards offered for their capture were tempting some associates to consider turning informant. And the increasing violence of their operations was attracting negative publicity that undermined their romantic image. Jesse's own behaviour was becoming more erratic and dangerous as the pressure mounted. He was drinking heavily, picking fights with subordinates, and making increasingly risky decisions that put the entire gang in jeopardy. The charming, calculating young man who had carefully built his legend was being replaced by a bitter, paranoid killer who trusted no one and saw enemies everywhere. The transformation was partly the result of external pressures, but it also reflected fundamental problems with Jesse's personality and worldview. He had never learned to accept limitations or compromise with reality. When the world didn't conform to his expectations, his instinct was to impose his will through violence rather than adapt his approach. This worked well enough when he was fighting guerrilla wars or robbing banks, but it was poorly suited to the complex challenges of maintaining a criminal organization under intense scrutiny. The gang's decline began with a series of mistakes and miscalculations that exposed them to greater risks than they had previously faced. A botched bank robbery in Northfield, Minnesota, in September 1876 resulted in the death or capture of several gang members and forced the survivors to scatter. Jesse and Frank managed to escape, but they lost many of their most trusted associates and found themselves more isolated than ever before. The Northfield raid was a turning point in the James Gang's fortunes, though Jesse didn't immediately recognize it as such. He continued to plan new operations and recruit new members, convinced that he could rebuild the gang and return to his previous level of success. But the magic was gone. The network of supporters that had protected him was shrinking, the law enforcement pressure was becoming unbearable, and his own judgment was deteriorating under the strain. The final phase of Jesse James's career would be marked by increasing desperation, growing paranoia, and the kind of mistakes that inevitably destroy even the most successful criminals. He was about to learn that fame and success, in his chosen profession, were ultimately self-defeating. The more notorious he became, the more people wanted to capture or kill him, until the very legend he had created became the instrument of his destruction. The failed Northfield bank robbery in September 1876 marked the beginning of the end for the James Gang, though Jesse James himself was too proud and too stubborn to accept it. The raid had been planned as their biggest score yet, a bank in a prosperous Minnesota town that should have been an easy target. Instead, it turned into a disaster that cost the gang half its members and destroyed the aura of invincibility that had protected them for nearly a decade. The robbery went wrong from the moment the gang entered Northfield. Unlike the small Missouri towns where the Hay had operated previously, Northfield was full of Union veterans who had no sympathy for former Confederate guerrillas. When the townspeople realized what was happening, they didn't panic or hide. They grabbed weapons and started shooting. The gang found themselves trapped in a running gun battle against dozens of armed citizens who were determined to stop them. By the time the shooting ended, 2 gang members were dead and several others were wounded. The survivors barely escaped with their lives, let alone any money. Worse, the raid had been so public and so well documented that law enforcement agencies across the region now had detailed descriptions of the gang members and could coordinate their pursuit more effectively than ever before. Jesse and Frank James managed to escape the immediate pursuit, but they were now hunted men in a way they had never been before. The Minnesota authorities offered unprecedented rewards for their capture: $10,000 for Jesse, dead or alive. The Pinkerton Detective Agency increased their presence in Missouri and began using more aggressive tactics to pressure the gang's supporters. Local law enforcement agencies that had previously been reluctant to pursue the gang now had political cover to take decisive action. The psychological impact of the Northfield disaster on Jesse James was profound and lasting. For the first time in his criminal career, he had been decisively defeated as ordinary citizens rather than professional law enforcement. The invincible outlaw who had robbed banks and trains with impunity had been driven off by shopkeepers and farmers. His confidence in his own abilities was shaken, and his judgment began to deteriorate rapidly. Jesse's response to defeat was to become more reckless rather than more careful. Instead of laying low and waiting for the heat to die down, he began planning new operations almost immediately. He seemed to believe that one spectacular success would restore his reputation and prove that the Northfield defeat had been a fluke. This was exactly the wrong approach to take when law enforcement pressure was at its highest. But Jesse was incapable of accepting that his glory days might be over. The gang's attempts to rebuild after Northfield were hampered by the reluctance of experienced criminals to join an organization that was under such intense scrutiny. Jesse was forced to recruit younger, less experienced men who were attracted by his reputation but lacked the skills and discipline of his original associates. These new recruits were more likely to make mistakes, more prone to panic under pressure, and less trustworthy when faced with the possibility of capture. The changed composition of the gang also altered its internal dynamics in ways that made effective leadership more difficult. The original members had been bound together by shared experiences in the Civil War and genuine personal loyalty to Jesse and Frank James. The new recruits were motivated primarily by greed and excitement, making them less reliable and more dangerous to the organization's security. Jesse's personal relationships were also deteriorating under the strain of constant pursuit and mounting paranoia. His marriage to Zerelda was strong enough to survive the external pressures, but the psychological toll of their lifestyle was enormous. They couldn't maintain a normal home or establish stable routines. They lived under false names, moved frequently, and had to be constantly prepared for sudden flight. The stress of this existence was wearing down both of them. The couple's children, born during this period, grew up knowing their father primarily as a dangerous stranger who appeared and disappeared unpredictably. Jesse loved his family, but he was rarely able to spend extended time with them. When he was present, he was often distracted by security concerns or planning for his next operation. The domestic happiness that might have provided some balance to his criminal career remained frustratingly out of reach. Jesse's relationship with his brother Frank was also becoming strained. Frank had always been the more cautious and thoughtful of the two brothers, and he was increasingly concerned about the direction their careers were taking. He could see that law enforcement pressure was making their continued operations unsustainable, and he wanted to explore the possibility of negotiating some kind of amnesty or simply disappearing to start new lives elsewhere. But Jesse refused to consider retirement or compromise. He had built his identity around being the most famous outlaw in America, and he couldn't imagine giving up that role to become an ordinary citizen. The idea of living quietly under an assumed name, working an honest job, and pretending to be someone else was intolerable to him. He would rather die as Jesse James than live as anyone else. This fundamental disagreement about their future created tension between the brothers that affected the entire organization. Frank's reluctance to participate in new operations made planning more difficult and reduced the gang's effectiveness. His obvious desire to quit the outlaw life also encouraged other members to question their own commitment to the cause. the law enforcement response to the gang's continued activities was becoming more sophisticated and more ruthless. The Pinkerton Agency had learned from their earlier failures and was now using techniques that were more appropriate to rural conditions. They were recruiting local informants, establishing surveillance networks, and coordinating with multiple jurisdictions to prevent the gang from simply crossing state lines to escape pursuit. More ominously, some law enforcement agencies were abandoning legal niceties in their pursuit of the gang. In January 1875, Pinkerton agents had raided the James family farm and thrown an incendiary device into the house, killing Jesse's 8-year-old half-brother and blowing off their mother's arm. The raid was officially described as an attempt to capture Jesse and Frank, but it was widely seen as an assassination attempt that went wrong. The attack on the James family farm backfired spectacularly from a public relations standpoint. Even people who had no sympathy for the gang's criminal activities were outraged by the targeting of women and children. The incident generated enormous sympathy for the James family and reinforced Jesse's image as a victim of unjust persecution. But it also demonstrated that law enforcement agencies were willing to use extreme measures that put everyone associated with the gang in mortal danger. Jesse's response to the attack was to become even more violent and unpredictable. He began talking about assassination missions against Pinkerton agents and government officials. He started carrying out robberies with a level of brutality that shocked even his own men. The charming gentleman bandit, who had built his reputation on courtesy and restraint, was being replaced by a killer who seemed to take pleasure in violence for its own sake. The transformation was partly strategic. Jesse understood that fear was his most effective weapon against increasingly aggressive law enforcement, but it was also psychological. Years of constant stress, mounting losses, and growing isolation were taking their toll on his mental health. He was drinking heavily, sleeping poorly, and showing signs of the paranoia that would eventually destroy him. During the late 1870s, the James gang pulled off several more robberies, but they were increasingly desperate affairs that generated more heat than profit. A train robbery near Glendale, Missouri, in October 1879, netted only $6,000, but resulted in massive publicity and increased law enforcement pressure. A stagecoach robbery in Kentucky was so poorly planned that it barely covered the gang's expenses. Each operation was riskier and less profitable than the last. Jesse's judgment was clearly deteriorating, but he refused to listen to advice from more cautious associates. He was convinced that one spectacular robbery would solve all their problems and restore their reputation. He began planning increasingly ambitious operations that required larger gangs and more complex coordination. These elaborate schemes were more likely to fail than simpler robberies, but Jesse seemed incapable of recognizing this obvious fact. The gang's last major train robbery occurred in July 1881, when they stopped to Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Train near Winston, Missouri. The operation was successful from a financial standpoint. They escaped with several $1,000s, but it was a public relations disaster. During the robbery, gang members killed the train's conductor and a passenger who tried to resist. The murders were unnecessary and counterproductive, generating enormous negative publicity and hardening public opinion against the gang. Jesse's response to criticism of the Winston robbery revealed how completely his perspective had become distorted by years of violence and paranoia. He wrote letters to newspapers claiming that the killings had been justified because the victims had been armed and dangerous. He accused his critics of bias and hypocrisy, arguing that law enforcement killed far more people than his gang ever had. He seemed genuinely unable to understand why people were outraged by the murder of innocent civilians. The Winston robbery marked the effective end of the James gang as a functioning criminal organization. Several members quit in disgust at the unnecessary violence, while others were arrested or killed in subsequent law enforcement operations. Jesse found himself increasingly isolated. surrounded by a shrinking circle of associates who were more interested in the rewards offered for his capture than in continued loyalty to his cause. By early 1882, Jesse James was a desperate man living on borrowed time. He was 34 years old but looked much older, worn down by years of stress and violence. His hair was turning grey, his hands shook when he wasn't drinking, and he had developed a nervous habit of constantly checking over his shoulder. The confident young outlaw, who had once seemed invincible, had become a paranoid fugitive who trusted no one and saw enemies everywhere. The end, when it came, would be both inevitable and shocking, the result of Jesse's own fatal combination of arrogance and desperation, played out in a quiet house in St. Joseph, Missouri, where the most famous outlaw in American history would finally meet the fate he had been running from for nearly 2 decades. By the spring of 1882, Jesse James was living under the assumed name of Thomas Howard in a modest rented house at 1318 Lafayette Street in St. Joseph, Missouri. He had moved there with his wife Zerelda and their 2 young children, hoping to lie low while planning what he intended to be his comeback robbery. But the quiet domestic scene was an illusion. Jesse was more hunted and desperate than he had ever been, surrounded by enemies and betrayed by men he had trusted with his life. The house itself was carefully chosen for defensive purposes rather than comfort. It sat on a corner lot with good sight lines in all directions, allowing Jesse to spot potential threats before they could get close. The doors were reinforced and fitted with multiple locks. The windows were positioned so that Jesse could observe the street while remaining hidden from view. Even in this supposed sanctuary, he lived like a man under siege. Jesse's daily routine reflected his growing paranoia and declining mental state. He rarely went outside during daylight hours, and when he did, he wore disguises and took circuitous routes to avoid being followed. He kept loaded weapons within reach at all times, slept in different rooms on an irregular schedule, and had established multiple escape routes from the house. The easy confidence that had once made him so effective as an outlaw leader had been replaced by a constant, gnawing fear that death was lurking around every corner. The 2 men sharing the house with Jesse and his family were Bob and Charlie Ford, brothers who had recently joined what remained of the James gang. Jesse had recruited them despite having serious doubts about their loyalty and competence. Experienced criminals were no longer willing to associate with him because the risks had become too great and the rewards too small. He was forced to work with whoever he could find, regardless of their qualifications or trustworthiness. The Ford brothers were exactly the kind of men Jesse would have rejected during his glory days. They were small-time criminals from Ray County, Missouri, with reputations for cowardice and unreliability. Bob Ford, the younger brother, was 20 years old and desperate to make a name for himself. Charlie Ford was older but equally unstable, known for drinking too much and talking too freely when he was drunk. Neither man had the discipline or loyalty that successful outlaw gangs required. But Jesse was no longer in a position to be choosy about his associates. His original gang had been destroyed at Northfield, and subsequent attempts to rebuild it had failed disastrously. Most of his longtime supporters had been arrested, killed, or driven underground. The network of safe houses and sympathetic contacts that had once protected him was largely gone. He was reduced to working with whoever was willing to take the enormous risks that came with association with Jesse James. The Ford brothers had their own reasons for accepting those risks, reasons they hadn't shared with Jesse. Both men had been in contact with law enforcement officials and were secretly negotiating to betray their famous associate in exchange for reward money and amnesty for their own crimes. The bounty on Jesse's head had reached $10,000, a fortune that represented more money than most people earned in a decade. The negotiations between the Ford brothers and Missouri Governor Thomas T. Crittenden had been going on for weeks. Crittenden had made the capture of Jesse James a personal crusade, increasing the rewards and authorizing law enforcement agencies to use any means necessary to bring the outlaw to justice. He had also made it clear that he didn't particularly care whether Jesse was taken alive or dead, as long as the threat he represented was eliminated. Bob Ford had met secretly with Sheriff James Timberlake and other officials to work out the details of the betrayal. The plan was simple. Ford would kill Jesse when the opportunity presented itself, then claim the reward money and receive a pardon for his own criminal activities. It was a straightforward business transaction that would solve problems for everyone involved, except Jesse James. The morning of April 3rd, 1882, began like many others in the Thomas Howard household. Jesse woke late and spent considerable time checking the street for signs of surveillance before allowing anyone to leave the house. He was planning a bank robbery in Platte City, Missouri, and was becoming increasingly impatient with the delays caused by security concerns. The inactivity was making him restless and short-tempered, increasing the tension in a household that was already on edge. Jesse's behavior that morning would later be analysed by historians and psychologists trying to understand why he made the fatal mistake that cost him his life. Some suggested that he was suffering from depression and had subconsciously decided to end his tormented existence. Others argued that years of stress had impaired his judgment and made him careless about security. Still others believed that he was simply having an off day and let his guard down at the worst possible moment. The truth was probably simpler and more tragic. Jesse James was tired. Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of living in constant fear. He was only 34 years old, but he felt like an old man. The life that had once seemed so exciting and romantic had become a grinding ordeal that offered no hope of redemption or escape. He was trapped by his own legend, unable to retire, but increasingly unable to continue. That morning, Jesse did something he had trained himself never to do. He removed his guns while other people were in the room. The weapons were heavy and uncomfortable, and he was planning to dust some pictures hanging on the wall. For just a few minutes, he allowed himself to act like a normal person in a normal household, turning his back on men he should never have trusted, and giving them the opportunity they had been waiting for. Bob Ford was cleaning his own revolver when he noticed that Jesse had unbuckled his gun belt and placed his weapons on a bed in another room. For weeks, Ford had been looking for a chance to kill Jesse without risking his own life in a gunfight. Jesse James was faster and more accurate with firearms than almost anyone alive, and Ford knew he would lose any fair fight between them. But this wasn't intended to be a fair fight. Ford stood up quietly, drew his weapon, and aimed at the back of Jesse's head while his victim was reaching up to adjust a picture frame. "Goodbye, Jesse," he said, and pulled the trigger. The bullet entered Jesse's skull just behind his right ear and killed him instantly. The most famous outlaw in American history collapsed to the floor of his modest rented house, dead at the age of 34, killed not in a dramatic shootout, but by a coward with a gun who shot him in the back. The sound of the gunshot brought Zerelda James running from another room, where she had been caring for her children. She found her husband's body on the floor, blood pooling beneath his head, and the Ford brothers standing over him with their weapons drawn. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. Then Bob Ford said, "I have killed Jesse James," as if he couldn't quite believe what he had done. Zerelda's reaction was a mixture of grief, rage, and bitter resignation. She had known this day would come eventually. No one could live the life Jesse had chosen and expect to die peacefully in bed. But the manner of his death, shot down by men he had trusted while doing something as innocent as dusting a picture, seemed particularly cruel and meaningless. The great Jesse James, the man who had terrorized the frontier for 16 years, had died like any other victim of violence. The Ford brothers immediately fled the house and went to the local authorities to claim their reward. They told a story about killing Jesse in self-defense during an argument, but the evidence clearly showed that he had been shot in the back while unarmed. Public reaction to the shooting was swift and overwhelmingly negative. Even people who had supported law enforcement efforts to capture Jesse were disgusted by the cowardly manner of his death. Bob Ford became one of the most hated men in America overnight. He was called a traitor, a coward, and a backshooter. Songs were written about his treachery. Death threats poured in from across the country. The reward money he had killed for became a curse that followed him for the rest of his short life. He would be shot and killed himself 10 years later, dying as violently as the man he had betrayed. The news of Jesse James's death travelled across the country by telegraph, making front-page headlines in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. The reaction was extraordinary for the death of a criminal: grief, outrage, and a sense that something important had ended. Jesse James had become more than just an outlaw. He had become a symbol of American individualism and resistance to authority. His death marked the end of an era. The funeral was held at the James family farm in Clay County, Missouri, where Jesse had been born 34 years earlier. Thousands of people attended, many of them traveling hundreds of miles to pay their respects to the dead outlaw. The crowd included former Confederate soldiers, sympathetic civilians, curiosity seekers, and even some law enforcement officials who had pursued Jesse for years but respected his abilities. Zerelda Samuel, Jesse's mother, turned the funeral into a final act of defiance against the authorities who had hounded her son to his grave. She displayed his body in the family home and charged visitors 25 cents to view it, using the money to pay for the funeral expenses. She also sold photographs of the corpse and pieces of the coffin as souvenirs, understanding that Jesse's death had only enhanced his commercial value. The burial took place in the yard of the James family farm, rather than in a public cemetery, partly for security reasons and partly to maintain family control over Jesse's final resting place. The location would become a pilgrimage site for people who viewed Jesse as a folk hero rather than a criminal. For decades after his death, visitors would come to pay their respects and hear stories about the famous outlaw from family members who had known him. Jesse James was dead, but the legend of Jesse James was just beginning. Within weeks of his death, publishers were rushing biographies and dime novels into print, most of them bearing little resemblance to the actual facts of his life. The real Jesse, violent, paranoid, increasingly desperate in his final years, was replaced by a romanticized figure who robbed only from the rich and corrupt, treated his victims with courtesy, and died heroically fighting overwhelming odds. This mythologized version of Jesse James would prove more durable and influential than the historical reality. He became a symbol of American rebellion against corporate power and government authority, a folk hero who represented the common man's desire to strike back at forces beyond his control. The fact that the real Jesse had been driven primarily by greed and revenge, rather than noble ideals, was conveniently forgotten in favor of a more inspiring narrative. The transformation of Jesse James from criminal to folk hero reflected deeper currents in American culture during the late 19th century. The country was changing rapidly, becoming more industrial and urban, more regulated and bureaucratic. Many people felt nostalgic for an earlier era when individuals could shape their own destinies through courage and determination. Jesse James, reimagined as a heroic rebel, became a symbol of that vanishing frontier spirit. The legend also reflected ongoing sectional tensions left over from the Civil War. In the defeated South, Jesse James became a symbol of continued resistance to Northern domination. His robberies were reinterpreted as acts of war against the forces that had destroyed the Confederacy. His death was seen as martyrdom in the cause of Southern honor and independence. But perhaps most importantly, the Jesse James legend tapped into fundamental American ambivalence about law and order, authority and freedom. Americans have always been suspicious of concentrated power and sympathetic to individuals who challenge it, even when those individuals are clearly criminals. Jesse James embodied this contradiction. He was simultaneously a dangerous criminal and a romantic hero, a killer and a symbol of freedom. The real Jesse James died on April 3rd, 1882, shot in the back by a man he had trusted. But the mythical Jesse James would live forever, appearing in countless books, movies, songs, and stories that would keep his legend alive for generations. The farm boy who had become an outlaw to survive the aftermath of the Civil War had achieved a kind of immortality that few people in any era can claim. His story remains compelling more than a century after his death because it captures something essential about the American experience: the dream of unlimited freedom, the reality of violent consequences, and the thin line between hero and villain that runs through so much of our national mythology. Jesse James lived that contradiction fully and died because of it, leaving behind a legend that says as much about America as it does about the man himself. In the end, Jesse James got exactly what he had always wanted: to be remembered. The price he paid for that immortality was everything else: his family, his peace of mind, his life itself. Whether the bargain was worth making is a question that each person must answer for themselves. But there's no denying that Jesse Woodson James, dead at 34 in a rented house in Missouri, had become the most famous outlaw in American history and one of the most enduring figures in American folklore. The boy who had once dreamed of following his father's footsteps as a preacher had instead become a legend whose story would be told and retold for as long as Americans remained fascinated by tales of crime, punishment, and the eternal struggle between order and chaos on the frontier of human ambition. The death of Jesse James on April 3rd, 1882, marked the end of one story, but the beginning of another, far more enduring tale. Within hours of Bob Ford pulling that trigger in the modest house on Lafayette Street, the process of transforming Jesse James from man into myth had already begun. The newspapers that carried the story of his death were already reshaping the narrative, emphasizing the dramatic elements while downplaying the more sordid realities of his final years. The immediate aftermath of Jesse's assassination revealed the complex and contradictory feelings that Americans had developed toward their most famous outlaw. In Missouri, where Jesse had been both hunted and protected for 16 years, the reaction was one of genuine grief, mixed with outrage at the manner of his killing. Even people who had never supported his criminal activities were appalled that he had been shot in the back by men he had trusted. The code of the frontier demanded that a man face his enemies honestly, and Bob Ford's cowardly act violated those deeply held principles. But the reaction wasn't limited to Missouri or even to the former Confederate states. Across the country, newspaper editorials and public speeches wrestled with the meaning of Jesse James's life and death. Some portrayed him as a monster whose reign of terror had finally ended, but others described him as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, a man driven to crime by the injustices of Reconstruction and the impossible situation faced by former Confederate guerrillas in the post-war world. The debate over Jesse's legacy began almost immediately and has continued to this day. Was he a cold-blooded killer who deserved his fate, or a romantic rebel who challenged corrupt authority? Was he motivated by greed and bloodlust, or by a twisted sense of honor and justice? The historical evidence supports multiple interpretations, which has allowed each generation to reimagine Jesse James according to its own values and concerns. Zerelda James, now a widow at 28, with 2 young children to support, found herself at the center of this mythologizing process. She understood instinctively that Jesse's death had created valuable opportunities if she could manage them carefully. The farm where he was buried became a tourist attraction almost immediately, and Zerelda began charging admission to visitors who wanted to see the grave of the famous outlaw. She also became the guardian of Jesse's reputation, giving interviews to journalists and authors who were eager to write about his life. Zerelda consistently portrayed her late husband as a gentleman who had been forced into crime by circumstances, emphasizing his courtesy to victims and his loyalty to family and friends. She downplayed the violence and emphasized the romance, helping to create the sanitized version of Jesse James that would dominate popular culture for decades. The economic value of the Jesse James legend became apparent very quickly. Publishers rushed biographies and dime novels into print, most of them highly fictionalized accounts that bore little resemblance to historical reality. These books sold extremely well, particularly in the South and West, where readers were hungry for stories that validated their own resistance to federal authority and industrial capitalism. The dime novel version of Jesse James was a far cry from the paranoid, violent man who had died in St. Joseph. This fictional Jesse was unfailingly polite to women and children, robbed only from corrupt banks and railroads, shared his ill-gotten gains with the poor, and fought heroically against overwhelming odds. He was Robin Hood, with a six-shooter, a gentleman bandit, whose crimes were really acts of social justice. These romanticized accounts were often written by authors who had never met Jesse James or visited the places where he operated. They drew their inspiration not from historical research, but from earlier fictional works, creating a feedback loop that moved the legend further and further away from reality with each retelling. The real Jesse James became increasingly irrelevant to the mythical Jesse James who was capturing the American imagination. The process was accelerated by the testimony of people who claimed to have known Jesse personally. Many of these witnesses had their own reasons for presenting him in a favorable light. They were either former associates who wanted to avoid prosecution, or local residents who profited from the tourist trade that his legend attracted. Their stories, often told years or decades after the events they described, were coloured by nostalgia and self-interest. Frank James, Jesse's older brother and longtime partner in crime, played a crucial role in shaping the legend during the years immediately following the assassination. After Jesse's death, Frank negotiated a surrender to Missouri authorities and was tried for various crimes but never convicted. He spent his later years giving lectures and interviews about his outlaw career, always presenting himself and Jesse as honourable men who had been driven to desperate measures by intolerable circumstances. Frank's version of their story emphasized the political motivations behind their crimes and downplayed the mercenary aspects. According to Frank, they weren't common criminals, but Confederate patriots who refused to surrender even after the official end of the war. Their robberies were acts of continued resistance against Northern oppression, and their victims were legitimate military targets rather than innocent civilians. This political interpretation of the James Gang's activities resonated strongly with former Confederates who were struggling to come to terms with their defeat and the dramatic changes that Reconstruction had brought to the South. Jesse James became a symbol of defiance, a man who had refused to accept the new order and had fought against it until the very end. His death was portrayed not as the inevitable result of a criminal career, but as martyrdom in the cause of Southern independence. The legend was further enhanced by the dramatic circumstances surrounding Bob Ford's own death in 1892. Ford had spent the decade after Jesse's assassination trying to cash in on his notoriety, but he found that being known as the man who shot Jesse James was more curse than blessing. He was universally despised, constantly threatened, and never able to enjoy the reward money that had motivated his betrayal. Ford was eventually shot and killed in a saloon in Creede, Colorado, by a man named Edward Kelly, who claimed to be avenging Jesse James. The killing was probably motivated by a personal dispute rather than loyalty to Jesse's memory, but it was immediately interpreted as poetic justice by people who believed that Ford had deserved punishment for his treachery. The fact that the coward who had killed Jesse James had himself died violently seemed to validate the moral universe in which such legends operated. Kelly became a folk hero overnight, celebrated as the man who had avenged the great Jesse James. Songs were written about his deed, and he received thousands of letters of support from people across the country. When Kelly was tried for Ford's murder, the jury was clearly sympathetic to his actions, and he received a relatively light sentence considering the circumstances. The contrast between the public reaction to Ford's death and Jesse's death revealed how completely the outlaw's reputation had been rehabilitated in the decade since his assassination. Ford was mourned by no one and celebrated by many, while Jesse was increasingly remembered as a tragic hero who had died too young. The moral calculus that had once condemned Jesse as a killer now elevated him as a victim. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Jesse James legend continued to evolve and expand. The rapid industrialization of America was creating new anxieties about the concentration of economic power and the loss of individual autonomy. Jesse James, reimagined as a champion of the common man against corporate greed, became a symbol of resistance to these unwelcome changes. The emergence of labor unions and populist political movements provided new contexts for interpreting Jesse's story. His robberies were reframed as strikes against capitalist exploitation. His victims were portrayed as symbols of an unjust economic system, and his death was seen as the inevitable fate of anyone who challenged the power of the wealthy elite. This interpretation was historically dubious. Jesse had been motivated primarily by personal grievances and financial gain rather than any coherent political philosophy, but it served the psychological needs of people who felt powerless in the face of economic and social change. The mythical Jesse James gave them a hero who had fought against the same forces they faced, even if he had ultimately been defeated. The early 20th century saw the Jesse James legend transition from print to new forms of media that would reach even larger audiences. Silent films began featuring stories loosely based on his exploits, further romanticizing his image and introducing him to urban audiences who had no direct experience of frontier life. These films emphasized action and adventure, while avoiding the moral complexities that made the real Jesse James such a troubling figure. Radio programs of the 1930s and 1940s continued the mythologizing process, presenting Jesse as a straightforward hero fighting against corruption and injustice. The Great Depression had created new sympathy for outlaws who robbed banks, and Jesse James fit perfectly into the cultural narrative of common people struggling against powerful institutions. The fact that he had been dead for 50 years made it easier to ignore the inconvenient aspects of his actual career. Hollywood's treatment of the Jesse James story reached its peak with films like Jesse James, 1939, starring Tyrone Power, and The Return of Frank James, 1940, starring Henry Fonda. These movies presented Jesse as a noble outlaw driven to crime by railroad company corruption and railroad detective brutality. They were enormously popular and helped establish the version of Jesse James that would dominate popular culture for decades. The Hollywood Jesse bore almost no resemblance to the historical figure, but that didn't matter to audiences who were more interested in entertainment than education. The films created a coherent narrative that explained Jesse's crimes in terms that contemporary viewers could understand and sympathize with. He wasn't a criminal. He was a victim fighting back against institutional oppression. This sanitized version of Jesse James became so dominant that it began to influence serious historical scholarship. Biographers writing in the mid-20th century often accepted the romantic interpretation of his life without sufficient critical examination of the sources. The legend had become so powerful that it was reshaping the historical record rather than being shaped by it. The 1960s and 1970s brought new interest in Jesse James as a counterculture figure who had rejected societal norms and chosen to live by his own rules. The fact that he had been hunted by law enforcement agencies made him appealing to young people who were suspicious of government authority and institutional power. Jesse became a symbol of rebellion against the establishment, even though his actual rebellions had been motivated by very different concerns. Folk singers like Bob Dylan referenced Jesse James in songs that portrayed him as an authentic American original who had refused to compromise with a corrupt system. This interpretation ignored the violence and self-interest that had characterized his actual career, but it served the cultural needs of people who were looking for heroes who had maintained their integrity in the face of overwhelming pressure to conform. The late 20th century saw a more complex and nuanced understanding of Jesse James begin to emerge as historians gained access to better sources. and applied more sophisticated analytical methods to his story, scholars began to examine the social and economic context that had shaped his life, the psychological factors that had influenced his choices, and the ways that his legend had been constructed and maintained over time. This more critical approach revealed the extent to which the popular image of Jesse James had been shaped by myth rather than history. The real Jesse emerged as a far more complicated figure, intelligent but not particularly principled, charismatic but increasingly unstable, capable of both loyalty and betrayal depending on circumstances. He was neither the noble hero of popular culture nor the simple monster of law enforcement propaganda, but a complex human being whose choices had been shaped by the traumatic circumstances of his youth and the limited options available to him as an adult. Modern historians have also paid more attention to the victims of Jesse's crimes, people whose suffering had been largely ignored in earlier accounts that focused exclusively on the romantic aspects of his career. The bank tellers who had faced his guns, the train passengers who had been robbed, the law enforcement officers who had died pursuing him. All of these people had stories that deserved to be told alongside the legend of Jesse James. The contemporary understanding of Jesse James is more balanced and historically accurate than previous versions, but it has had little impact on his popular image. The mythical Jesse remains more powerful than the historical Jesse, continuing to appear in movies, television shows, novels, and songs that prefer romance to reality. Each generation continues to reinvent him according to its own needs and values, ensuring that the legend will outlive any attempt to contain it within historical facts. Today, more than 140 years after his death, Jesse James remains one of the most recognizable figures in American history. His gravesite still attracts thousands of visitors each year. His name still appears regularly in popular culture. His story continues to fascinate people who are drawn to tales of rebellion, adventure, and the eternal conflict between individual freedom and social order. The enduring appeal of Jesse James says something important about American culture and the American character. We are a nation that has always been ambivalent about authority, suspicious of institutions, and sympathetic to underdogs who challenge the system. Jesse James embodies these contradictory impulses, representing both our admiration for individual courage and our anxiety about the costs of unlimited freedom. His legend also reflects our complicated relationship with violence and its role in American history. Jesse James was undoubtedly a killer, but he has been transformed into a folk hero whose violence is either ignored or justified as necessary resistance to oppression. This transformation reveals our discomfort with the brutal realities of our past and our preference for stories that make violence seem noble rather than tragic. Perhaps most importantly, the Jesse James legend demonstrates the power of storytelling to shape historical memory and cultural identity. The real Jesse James died in 1882, but the mythical Jesse James has achieved a kind of immortality that transcends historical fact. His story has become part of the American narrative, a tale we tell ourselves about who we are and what we value. Whether this is ultimately good or bad for American culture is a question that each person must answer for themselves. But there's no denying that Jesse Woodson James, the farm boy who became an outlaw and died at 34 in a rented house in Missouri, achieved something that few people in any era can claim. He became a legend that has outlasted empires and will probably outlast the nation that created him. The story of Jesse James is ultimately the story of America itself. Violent and idealistic, brutal and romantic, driven by impossible dreams and haunted by irreconcilable contradictions. He was our outlaw, our rebel, our hero, our villain. He was us, for better and for worse. And that's why his story continues to matter more than a century after the last shot was fired and the last chapter was written. In the quiet house on Lafayette Street where Jesse James died, there is now a museum dedicated to his memory. Visitors can see the room where he was killed, the bullet hole in the wall, the modest furnishings of his final home. They come seeking connection to a legend, but what they find is the reality of a life that ended too soon and too violently, leaving behind only questions about what might have been and what it all meant. The museum tells Jesse's story with appropriate historical context and scholarly balance, but most visitors probably leave with their preconceptions intact. The power of legend is stronger than the power of fact, and Jesse James the myth will continue to overshadow Jesse James the man for as long as people are drawn to stories of adventure, rebellion, and the eternal human desire to be remembered.